Hey gang, happy Halloween. Welcome to the 2024 Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories Halloween Extravaganza. I hope you dig these stories. Some are pretty creepy, and there's a couple that are creepy with a slightly humorous side. Everybody, sit back, enjoy, get ready for the spooky night that's just around the corner. Let's get it on. The Light in the Woods, submitted by Aaron. When I was in my teens in the early 2000s, I had a buddy that lived way out in the middle of nowhere, Indiana. The closest town was a place called Huron, but his house was a few miles out of that little burg on the only road that went out there. He lived close to the White River on kind of a peninsula. I knew Rocky, and yeah, that's his real name, as his dad and my dad were old friends, and our families would get together a couple of times a year. My family had actually moved to Louisville when I was 10, but I still talked to Rock on AOL and stuff. One year, my parents were going to Indianapolis for some work thing my dad had to do, and the trip fell on Halloween weekend. It was on a Friday, as I recall, and since my parents were going to be gone for the weekend, they made arrangements for me to stay at Rocky's house with his brother Enzo. Think they were Italian? So, I ended up getting a bonus day off as my parents were traveling north to the thing they were going to, and Rock's parents let him get out of school early to hang out with me. We did go into Huron to trick-or-treat that night, but when we got back to his house, we had a fire outside and s'mores and stuff. Since it was a Friday night, we were allowed to stay up late and goof off. After a while, Rock's dad said that he was going in for the night, and it was just the three of us out at the fire. We were trying to tell each other scary stories, but everything ended up sounding like movies we had seen. Then, Rocky brought up that there was this old cemetery that was out in the middle of nowhere, just about 1.5 miles from his house. It was at the end of a little road, and it's called Mundy Cemetery. He said we should trek through the forest and check it out, and if we left right then, we'd probably get there right at midnight. I was up for anything, and Enzo was down for anything us older guys were doing. The funny thing is that so many of the stories I hear on Uncle Josh's channel are of kids sneaking out at night. But their dad said, have a good time and be safe. I mean, he never even batted an eye that 3 teenage kids were going to traipse through the dark forest in the middle of the night. Times have changed for sure. We got some flashlights and off we went, with Rocky leading the way with a compass to keep us heading south. It wasn't an easy hike, but we were really stoked to see this cemetery, and it didn't take too long for us to come to the back of it. It's not a big thing, it's more like a family plot in the middle of nothing. I remember the moon being like a quarter that night, and it gave us a little light as we agreed to turn off our flashlights when we went into the cemetery for the full scare effect. Rocky was talking about asking questions to see if the spirits of anyone in the cemetery would come out, and I'll admit it was pretty creepy out there. Enzo was 2 years younger than us and didn't seem fazed at all. He was quickly moving from monument to headstone, trying to read the names of the people buried there. After about 20 minutes, the wind picked up out of nowhere, and we heard a low moan that seemed to come from every direction. I looked at Rock and said, "Dude, what was that?" He was busy looking all around. The moan came again after a minute, and we decided that we'd better get moving back to Rock's house. Enzo then did something that has baffled me to this day. He kicked at one of the monuments, and it didn't budge an inch, by the way, and he said something like, "Fuck this place." The moan came again even louder, and we all froze a second before running back through the forest. We ran for a minute or so and then stopped, all of us breathing heavily. What was once scary was now kind of funny, and we all started laughing at the situation and what Enzo had said. As we stood there in the darkness, I looked up over Rock's shoulder and saw a dim light back where the cemetery was. I stared at it for a minute before Rock said, What are you looking at?" I said, "That light, see it? Did we leave a flashlight back there?" Enzo and Rock said no. We looked at it again, and it looked like a ball of light at that point. but it didn't get any bigger. Both of them looked back and said, "Whoa, what is that?" It sort of swayed there. Because it was a ways back, I couldn't tell if it was on the ground or up in the air. But I knew it wasn't a good thing, and I said so out loud. "Guys, let's get going," I said, and I started walking away, not really knowing where I was going. Enzo, with balls of steel, wanted to go back and see what it was, but Rock overruled him and said, "Dude, for all we know, it's someone who doesn't want us over there, and that's worse than any ghost." As we were babbling away, we didn't notice that the light had suddenly gotten closer to us, like half the distance. I finally noticed and said, "Oh shit, guys, run!" Not bothering to think about our direction, we all just started running through the trees as fast as we could. Every once in a while I would stop and look back, but that light was still there, following us. Now it was about the size of a headlight of a car. And that's when the sounds came, like little kids running through the forest and giggling. The best way I can describe it is like that scene in Blair Witch with the little kids out in the woods. I know I mentioned that everything sounds like a movie, but this was for real. I took off again, following Rocky's flashlight bouncing off the ground, but the kids' laughing got louder. Rock and Enzo came up on a big rock that they were familiar with, and Rock said, "We're almost home, keep running, don't look back." We all kept racing for his house, and finally broke through the trees onto his back lot. From there it was just another 100 feet or so to his back deck, and we booked it as fast as we could. I looked back once more, and saw that there were now about 5 of those lights behind us, but they all stopped at the edge of the trees and just sort of hung there. As we hit the back deck, we all looked at them, and the laughing stopped. Suddenly, like a crack of thunder, there was a loud boom, and there was this really loud, deep laughter that rang out. It was so loud that Rock's parents came outside, his dad holding a shotgun. "What the hell's going on out here?" he asked, and we were all too keyed up to make any sense of what was going on. Finally, Enzo said, "Forest, there's something in the forest, Dad," and his dad looked up. The lights were still there. The deep laughter had stopped, and then the lights faded back into the trees, and everything was quiet. "Boys, get inside," was all his dad said. We went in and sat at their kitchen table, bathed in sweat and shaking. We told Rock's dad everything that had happened, and he didn't yell or laugh at us. He just listened. Finally he said, "Have some warm cider. And whatever you do, don't go back to that cemetery again." That was all he said. We did have some cider. His mom fixed it for us, and then we went to bed. But every once in a while, one of us would go to the window and look out. But thankfully nothing was there. After all of this, Rocky said that nothing else ever happened out there either. I talked to him last week. He lives in Florida now, and I mentioned that night, and he laughed and said, "Man, we got out of there in the nick of time, didn't we?" I've always wondered what those lights were. Were they really the ghosts of people buried there? I mean, what were they? I mean, whatever it was, certainly didn't want us out there, and they did their job. Rocky told me he and Enzo never went back there in the day or the night. It was the first and last time their family heard that laughter and saw those lights. The Visitor, submitted by Lexicon Devil. Okay, trigger warning for addiction and suicide. I was never a huge bar hopper when I was in college. Party guy? Oh yeah. But I preferred to do house parties or just gatherings with friends. When people started to head to my college town's bars as the night wore on, I was the one who needed to be begged to go out. I saw it all as a waste of money. I mean, overpriced booze I already had at my place, music I didn't care for, and so on. I mean, girls obviously were a huge pull, but I just wasn't, and I am still not a bar or dance club guy. So, my senior year, I convinced a bunch of people we should go camping on Halloween night and have a fire, get blasted, and have a good time. There was a spot that a lot of people went to on some state land not far from my college. Just state land, not a campground or anything, but you could camp out there. Me and my immediate housemates invited about 7 people in total and decided to dress up for fun anyway. I mean, not everyone was going to, but there was also going to be some people who did want to go out on the town and then were going to meet us out there. A lot of them were dressing up, so we thought, what the hell, we should too. On Halloween Day, we packed up some tents, a bunch of firewood we bought from a local farmer, got some food, and a mess of coolers for beer. It was a pretty mild fall that year, and while the temps were dipping into the mid to low 50s at night, no one was too worried about being cold. Our biggest fear was hunters that were already out, but thankfully we didn't see any or hear any shots fired. We were about to deal with something much worse. We drove out to the place that we wanted to camp, and it was about 200 yards into the woods from a fire road where we parked. Obviously, no one else was out there, and the town was about 10 miles behind us. It was just going to be a fun party in the woods, or so we thought. By late afternoon, we had set up a bunch of tents and got an area cleared for a fire. We were drinking the whole time and whooping it up and having fun before things really got started when more people showed up. It was around 11 o'clock when the 7 of us were joined by another group of 8 friends, all lit from their parties and such. And we broke out more food for them and kept playing cards, telling stories, just having a party. At one point, one of the ladies had to take a powder, so she and another girl went into the darkness. They came running back after about 5 minutes and said there was someone out there walking around the woods. Those of us who had heard them say this couldn't believe it. I mean, we were miles from anywhere. Who the hell would be out walking around at this time of night? We got our answer 10 minutes later. This really weird dude showed up at the edge of our firelight and loudly said, "Hey, you guys having a party? Got room for one more?" My buddy Scott and I checked him out. He was really thin, and he had long hair and a ponytail. He honestly looked like a wannabe hippie, which wasn't too strange for the early 90s. And in retrospect, he kind of looked a little like Shannon Hoon. I asked him if he was by himself, and he had said that he'd gone out for a hike during the day and smoked a little too much weed and fell asleep. All of this was kind of in a monotone voice. Then he said when he woke up it was dark and he had lost the way that he'd been walking. In our drunkenness, we didn't question it and said, "Hey man, grab a beer." He did and hung out with us for a while, but didn't really say much and just sat on the ground drinking and listening. As the night went on, and the guy whose name I didn't get but later found out who he was, eventually grabbed a camp chair and a couple of beers and moved back into the shadows of the bonfire. I yelled over if he was okay, and he kind of grunted. And again, drunken me just shrugged my shoulders and kept partying. After a while, people began to calm down and things got mellow. Some weed was passed around and people either went to their tents or walked back to the road to sleep in their vehicles. I passed out with my girlfriend and didn't wake up until around 6:30 in the morning. The forest was quiet and daylight was still a little ways off. I got up quietly, letting my girlfriend snuggle into our big sleeping bag, and then I went outside to take a leak. Everything was so quiet and peaceful, and I took care of my business, and then noticed our visitor had fallen asleep in the camp chair and was just slumped there. He must have been freezing his ass off. But I suddenly felt something was off. I walked over to him and stopped when I saw the blood on his arms and the leaves underneath him. After a minute or two, I stepped towards him and saw that his face was ghastly white, like he was frozen or something. The wrists of his thin jacket were soaked with blood, and I yelled out in horror and shock. I kept screaming as I backed away, and that got everyone out there scrambling from their tents. One by one they came out asking what the hell was going on, and I could only point at the guy. My friend Paul, who's a lot braver than me, went over to him and told me what I already knew. The guy was dead. I told everyone to stay away from him, and Paul said that he'd go and get the police. I mean, thankfully for us, we were all over age and hadn't broken any laws, save for the weed, but that was gone by that time. Everyone was freaking out, and I said we should all go up and wait where we had parked, and there was plenty of yelling and screaming when people saw the dead guy sitting there. Paul took off and came back leading 3 sheriffs, and they all said to stay put, too. An ambulance came pulling up shortly after, and all of them went down to our campsite. More and more cops showed up and began asking us all questions, in small groups and one-on-one. I mean, no one could really share anything. I mean, none of us knew who the guy was. They took his body out of the forest, and some of the girls screamed even though they knew he was already dead. It still was a pretty creepy sight. The sheriffs got all of our information and told us that the area was now a crime scene and we had to leave all unnecessary stuff out there. A few of us went back to grab wallets and keys and purses and personal items, but that was it, all under the supervision of the sheriffs. I overheard one sheriff talking to an EMT guy and heard that the guy had slit his wrists, but he was also convinced the guy had taken something that they had to wait for tests to prove for that. For a few weeks, all of us were continually questioned by the cops more than once. I began to piece together some things, like the guy's name, and that he had taken a mess of sleeping pills and then cut his wrists. All of this happened right next to us, with none of us knowing. He wasn't from the area or a student at our college. He was some drifter from 3 states over, and how he ended up there was a mystery. This was over 30 years ago, and I still think about it. I wonder if we had been more engaging, maybe he wouldn't have done that. Or maybe we could have interrupted him in what he had planned. One more for the road, that sort of thing. I guess to many people, this isn't shit-your-pants scary, but it's by far the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me. Halloween night, or otherwise. Halloween Terror by VP. One Halloween night, I was a child of 8 years, preparing to go trick-or-treating with a group of neighborhood children. I was going with my friend Jenny, her friends Haley and Allie, and Jenny's older brother who would be supervising us. We had just gotten our costumes finished and were grabbing our candy bags, and just as we were about to leave, Jenny's mom announced that she had a few rules for us that we had to follow. We had to be home by 9 p.m., not to speak to strangers, and wherever we go, we were not to go down Captain Ellis Lane. "Why can't we go down there?" I asked her mother, to which the reply was, "That's my rule. Now go have fun." There was no further explanation. I knew where that road was because I had driven past it in the car with my mother multiple times, but we had never gone down it. It was just 3 streets down from mine and through a series of side streets that connected to mine, as well as to the main road. All I knew was that it was dark and desolate, and much more so than the other roads in the vicinity, and it did have an old abandoned farm a little ways down the road. From the main road, no houses were visible, so the road actually looked completely empty. After a passing thought of, "Oh, that street is a bit dark and poorly lit, that must be it," I put it out of my mind and left with my friends, ready to enjoy the evening. We went down several streets and had gathered a lot of candy, and people loved my costume. I was having a great night. I was ready to head home and mentioned to my friend's brother that we should start heading back, but my friends had other plans. On the way home, we stopped right in front of Captain Ellis Lane. I was perfectly content not going down there, but my friends all said, "What are we waiting for? Are we going or not?" I burst out, "No, we can't. Didn't you hear what Jenny's mom said? We're not supposed to go down there." But by that point it was too late. The rest of my friends had already descended into the darkness, leaving me standing there, so I ran to catch up. I looked down the street, and from the view of the main road it was completely unlit, and it really looked abandoned, in complete contrast to the other streets in the area, which were well lit and densely populated. I heard the rattling of a flag against a flagpole, but couldn't tell where the sound was coming from. Other than that, it was just the bristling of the wind through the trees. All I could see was one house immediately to my right, an old house that looked like a farmhouse at what appeared to be the end of the street, and there was a large fenced-off plot of land to the far right ahead. The left side of the street was covered with trees and brush, and honestly, it felt like I was walking down a road in the middle of nowhere, with something just lurking in the shadows waiting to jump out. Everyone else didn't say anything, but I didn't like it one bit. The road forked, and I looked to the right and saw that the street did, in fact, turn into a more normal-looking and better-lit street with several houses. To the left was a gravel road encircling a large fenced-off plot of farmland. I couldn't see the end of the farm, but I could barely make out that in the distance was a small white shed. All of a sudden, Jenny shouted, 1, 2, 3, I'll race you to the shed! And again I protested. Now I insisted that we were trespassing, and that the farm likely belonged to one of the houses that we had just passed. I didn't want to get in trouble, and I won't lie, I was scared. But I also knew I would once again be left in the dark to fend for myself if I didn't take off running toward the shed. Just as I prepared to go, my heart racing and pounding out of my chest, I heard the creaking of a door, which came to a hard thud as it shut. We all froze and stared at one another, trying to figure out where that sound had come from. Allie said it must be the shed. The door was probably not firmly secured and had just blown shut in the wind. That was her explanation, and I was prepared to accept it, but I didn't truly believe it. It was so far in the distance I could barely see it. It was just a vague outline. I wanted to turn and run back, but they began walking ahead of me on the gravel road, now slowly walking and trying to listen for the sound of any other activity. As we walked, I felt the distinct sensation that someone was following us. There were 5 of us, but whoever was walking furthest back said that they could hear footsteps immediately behind them. But when we stopped, the footsteps stopped with us. When we turned around, there was no one there. So Jenny's brother called out, "Hey, is there someone there?" And there was no response. As we approached the shed, I heard the rustling of leaves and footsteps in the woods to the right of the gravel road. These were not the sounds of an animal, but they sounded like human footsteps. I wasn't thinking of the paranormal at that point. I feared we were being followed by a living person, and I was terrified. Even with 5 of us, it would have been difficult to fend off an adult attacker. Haley then shouted out that she swore she saw a shadow dart in front of the shed and then disappear. I didn't see anything, and I was too nervous to think. We quietly climbed over a fence and were now in a large plot of farmland. The shed was only a few hundred feet in front of us. We approached it, and I was on high alert for any movement. I'm not going to lie, I was terrified. I didn't know why I didn't just turn and run back home by myself to Jenny's house when I was on the main road, because however dangerous it would have been, I would have felt much less nervous than where I was. Haley, being the bravest of us all, walked up to one of the shed windows and peered inside. She said it was too dark to see anything, so she took out a flashlight and began to look inside. For a few seconds, we just watched her looking around, and all seemed normal. And then suddenly, she let out a loud, terrifying scream and dropped her entire bucket of candy and ran away from us through the field and back over the fence. She was stuttering as she tried to tell us what she saw, but none of us understood what she was trying to say. She was shaking profusely and practically in tears and begged us to run back to her and walk back home. I could tell she was terrified and on the verge of a panic attack. Lights began to turn on in the few nearby houses, and voices could be heard. Haley's scream must have caught their attention. We quickly picked up our belongings and dashed back down the street as quietly as possible and headed back to the main road. No one saw us as we fled as fast as we could down the dark street. When we got back to Jenny's house, Haley confessed what she had seen. She said that she was looking in the shed, and at first she only saw gardening tools and empty crates. But then she said she saw a child. Not a normal child, but a small boy with gaping bloody holes where the eyes were supposed to be. A bony, skeleton-like, emaciated frame and the most disgusting rotten teeth she had ever seen. Smiling in a sinister smile, walking towards the window at her. We all froze, terrified by the thought. But we all promised that no matter what we did, we would keep it a secret from Jenny's mom that we disobeyed her rule. To this day, I don't know if she really saw the image of a child in the window or if she was just playing a prank on us. But recently I drove down the road during the daylight and noticed the shed was no longer there and had been replaced. I later learned that Jenny's mother had almost purchased a home on that street, but had decided against it because she preferred the street they ended up living on, and she too had found the abandoned farm area to be creepy and off-putting, and didn't want us there because it was poorly lit. I often wonder, though, did she ever see anything like Haley had seen that night? And that's why she didn't want to live there. I won't have the chance to ask her, but I'll always wonder if that was something to it. Terrifying Halloween Party Doublecross, submitted by Swisher. I'm going to start off by saying that I was not a saint growing up, and certainly wasn't one in my late teens and early 20s. I grew up a kid with a single dad who really did bust his ass to raise me and my sister, who was 2 years younger than me. We had lost our mom when I was 5, and my dad never remarried. We knew he was hurting a ton, but he didn't turn to booze or drugs. He turned to work. He worked all the time, and I mean all the time. He had a great job, but it called him away a lot. And at first my grandparents watched us while he was gone. His reward was a lot of money, and he saved for our futures, but also took us on really lavish trips 2 or 3 times a year. We did Disney, but we also went to Europe and Asia a lot. I learned a lot and saw a lot growing up. But in my teens, I started delving into stuff I shouldn't have, mainly drugs. This was in the early 80s, and there was a lot of stuff going around. I maintained my schoolwork, was a 2-sport letterman, did the band and the musical, and on the outside I looked like a normal kid. But I was also hanging out with a crowd that was into the darker side of life. Weed, cocaine, acid, you name it. Funny thing, I tried all of it, and I never really got hooked on anything. What I did do was get into moving it for another guy. A born salesman, just like my dad. In 1983, I was 15, and my dad started to allow me to stay home alone and watch my sister on his business trips. My grandparents had moved to Florida, and I was trusted to do the right thing, which, as I mentioned, I was really good at. We were typical Gen X kids. We learned to cook and clean and all that stuff on our own. We never threw massive parties and always went to school while my dad was away. Around that time, my dealer began trusting me to sell large parts of his stash to other kids at school. I mean, never at school, I wasn't that stupid. But it was known to those that needed to know that I was the guy who could get you what you wanted. I made a lot of money. My dealer, I'll call him John, took care of me. While some guys were flipping burgers or washing cars making around $3 an hour, I was clearing $75 or $100 for deals, all on the QT. Only once did I get nervous when some guys I had dealt to got busted with weed in school. My name came up in the investigation, not by the guys, mind you, but no one thought it could possibly be true. There was no way I was a drug dealer. Wow, enough backstory, you get the picture. I was a non-using drug dealer. After I graduated with honors, I had been accepted to a number of colleges, but wanted to take a year in between moving on to help out at home and keep watching my sister as she was getting ready to graduate as well. I got a job doing legit work, but kept doing my deals, which were getting bigger all the time. But now, it wasn't just high school kids, it was older cats. Lots of parties, lots of clubs. I mean, no one ever ID'd me in those places. I was there so much, everyone accepted that I was 21. All the while, I had grown up with a guy I'll call Bill. Bill was in my high school and was kind of a wayward kid. Not a total bad seed, but he was high all the time, and he had also started dabbling in pushing. I say pushing with him because he was more of a street dealer. I had no idea who his connection was, but it certainly wasn't mine. And we weren't in competition or anything either. So what the hell does all this have to do with Halloween? Okay. The year, 1987, there was going to be a big Halloween party at a club, and then an after-hours party that my guy asked me to oversee. There was going to be a lot of blow on hand, like $25,000 worth that I was in charge of. Along with that came a lot of cash for side shit that I was entrusted to take care of. At the end of it all, I was looking to bank about $8,000 for babysitting a bunch of coke and cokeheads. But you better believe I was nervous. It was really just me running shit. But being young and dumb, I thought I had a handle on everything. My girlfriend at the time knew what I was into, but I honestly think she thought it was exciting. She was another good kid with a wild side, and sadly she passed away about 15 years ago. But she was there that Halloween night. Bill got in touch with me before the party and said he knew some guys that wanted to buy a bunch of my load, more than half of it. I relayed that to my guy. When I told him, he was good with it, but for the first time he told me to watch my ass. He had never said that to me before. And in retrospect, had I really watched my ass, I would have never gone through with the party at all. The club thing went off without a hitch, and then a bunch of people made their way to this house out in the suburbs of my city. It was a big old number that my guy had rented for the distribution of the stuff. All told, there were maybe 50 people in the place. I had a bedroom upstairs with the stuff, and everything was going well. It was mostly people in their late 20s and early 30s, just getting ripped and dancing and doing whatever in their Halloween costumes. I had a couple of beers, but knew I had to stay sharp. Around 2:30 a.m., I heard some noise from downstairs that was not part of the party. People were yelling, and at first I thought it was the cops, and I looked at my girlfriend and said, "Quick, give me a hand with this," and handed her this bag of money, and I closed a case of weed and pills and baggies of coke. My guy had told me that there was a closet in the bedroom that was pretty well hidden, and he let me know how to hide in it if something went south. Well, right at that time, I figured shit was going south pretty quick. The door was actually part of a mirrored wall that had this splattered pattern on it, like marble. I know, super 80s. You could only tell there was a door in it by a very thin crack, and it opened if you pushed on it a little bit. I pushed on it, swung the door open, and just as I did that, I heard more voices screaming and Bill's voice yelling, saying, "Follow me." I pushed my girlfriend into the closet and then shut the door behind us, and we waited in the dark. We heard the bedroom door burst open and voices yelling, "Where's the shit? Where's this guy at?" Then Bill said, "They were in here all night. He's got a ton. He's got a huge roll, too. I'm not lying." We then heard the room getting trashed and voices of like 3 guys yelling and swearing. They went into the master bathroom. They looked in the bigger walk-in closet, and we just sat there holding our breath, praying they didn't notice this closet of shoes we were hiding in. Then everything got quiet, and all we heard was heavy breathing. Downstairs everything was quiet, but we did hear cars outside taking off and voices out there shouting, "Get out of the fucking way," and "Hey, move it, man." Then we heard one voice say, "Downstairs, Trigo." Trigo was Bill's nickname. We heard whoever was out there leave the room and go back down the stairs. And then I heard Bill saying, "Dude, no, it's here. I know it's here." There was one more, "Dude, come on, man." And then 3 shots rang out. My girlfriend and I jumped and almost yelled, but I hissed at her to be quiet. I was literally shaking, and so was she. We heard some murmuring, and then everything got quiet. A few minutes later, we heard a vehicle start up and drive off down the driveway. We were still sitting there shaking and freaking the fuck out for 5 or 10 minutes. And that's when I said, "We need to get out of here right now." I slowly pushed the door open, and it was dead silent in the house. I led the way, and we quietly walked to the stairs and waited a minute, and then we went down slowly. What we saw down there, I'll never forget. A trashed living room, and the body of Bill lying face down on the carpet in a pool of dark blood. My girlfriend screamed, and I just kept staring at the body of this guy I had known for years. I told her again that we had to go, and I pushed her outside to my car, and I started driving. I could barely keep the car straight. I was shaking so much. My girlfriend couldn't stop crying, but we finally made it to a little gas station, and I pulled in. We sat there for a few minutes not knowing what to say. I mean, we were in total shock. Then we saw 2 cop cars coming down the road with their lights on, heading back towards the house. When they went past, I quickly got back on the road and went home. No one was there. Dad was in California, and my sister was staying with a friend that night. We collapsed on the couch, and I did the only thing I knew to, and that was call my guy to let him know what was up. He was pissed beyond all belief, but said he'd take care of everything. He reassured me that it wasn't my fault, but man, he was fucking mad. He said to meet him in the morning with the stuff that I had, and I said okay. I didn't sleep at all, but my girlfriend crashed out in exhaustion. The next day, I met my guy in a park and handed everything over to him. He asked me a million questions that I couldn't answer, like who it was that was there, questions about Bill, all kinds of stuff. He then told me it was going to be fine and counted out like $4,000 and gave it to me. I took it and told him right then and there that I was done, and he just shook his head and said, "I get it." And then he said something that I'll never forget too. He looked at me dead in the eyes and said, "Go be somebody, you hear?" And that was it. The guys who shot Bill were never caught, but I did get the lowdown on what was up. Bill, being the junkie that he was, owed them a boatload of money and decided to set me up to settle his score with them, and then some. And obviously, that's not what happened. In the end, I went off to college and never messed around with that stuff again. My girlfriend promptly broke up with me, which I don't blame her for, but I do know she never told anyone what had happened. So, that's it. The story of the scariest Halloween I've ever had. And I'm not going to lie, I think about it every time Halloween rolls around. How close I had come to getting myself and my girlfriend killed. A lot of lessons learned for sure, and I feel more bad for the trauma that it gave her. As for Bill, well, I forgave him, because it's easy to forgive the dead. Had things gone another way, I'm sure I wouldn't have come to that peace. Thanks for sharing this if you do. Tragic End by the Ouija. Submitted by Spirit Waiting. This was my second experience with a Ouija board. I had just married my husband, and it was during Halloween. The seance took place at his grandmother's house during a family gathering. I was 16 at the time. I know I was young to get married. 3 of my husband's female cousins and 1 aunt, who was our age as well, decided to play just for fun. I already knew better and decided to sit next to them instead of playing. They all sat on the bed with the Ouija in the middle of them. My husband stood in the doorway as I stood behind one of the cousins. My husband decided to dim the light as they began the questions. The first one they asked was the typical question, "Is anyone here with us?" The planchette moved slowly towards the yes. Everyone started laughing, believing it had been one of them slightly moving the planchette. So another cousin asked another question, and I'm not sure what she asked or what the answer was. But the next question asked is what still has my memory in pause. The aunt at the time who was engaged asked a personal question. She asked, "Will I get married to the man I'm engaged to?" and immediately no popped into my head. I looked down as the planchette started circling in a rapid fashion, then suddenly jerked to 2 letters that spelled out N-O. Then the planchette jerked to the goodbye. My husband's aunt jumped up and started saying the board was just a game and was highly upset at her nieces. She literally thought they had been toying with her, and all the while we had all fallen silent and looked at each other in shock. I was terrified. Not long after that, we all forgot about the Ouija board and that session, and we continued on with our lives. The next holiday came and we were all together again and started talking about that Halloween incident from before. We all admitted to being truly freaked out, and all the cousins still stuck to their guns that they hadn't moved the planchette. A couple of weeks after Thanksgiving, the aunt and her fiancé were in a terrible car wreck. She barely made it out, having broken both hips and several other bones. Her fiancé? He died instantly and never made it away from the scene. They were due to marry that following February, only a few short months away. To this day, that woman will not talk about the Ouija board experience. None of us will. This is the first time I've told this story in a very long time. The Woman in My Room, submitted by N. Shively. In 1979, just as my Orioles were making a move on the American League pennant, my family moved from Bel Air, Maryland to State College, PA, since my dad took a job as a professor at Penn State. I was 9 years old and miserable. I left my friends, the only house I had known, and everything that was comfortable and known, to the middle of Pirates country. We had to stay in some weird house on Crestmont Ave for like a month, because the family that was moving out of their home in Shingletown Gap wasn't ready and we couldn't move in. It was a little weird that the place we were staying in was available for just a month, well after the semester had started. We didn't even bother to unpack everything, we just unpacked what we needed. So there were half-packed boxes all over the house which did nothing to dispel its creepy vibe. It was maybe a little nicer than the brick duplex we had lived in Bel Air, but it wasn't anything spectacular. Everything about it was just dark. There was just this feeling of stillness and brooding. The one good thing about it was that my brother and I had separate bedrooms, and mine was the larger of the two, with a dormer towards the front of the house. There weren't a lot of trees around, and there was an alley out back we could play in, but we didn't because it smelled like dogs. I was not adjusting well. Everything sucked. The Orioles lost to the Pirates, and it was coming up on Halloween, and I was in a strange neighborhood that I didn't know and I wouldn't ever get to know. I didn't know any kids in the neighborhood, and I hadn't gotten in with anyone at school. I missed my friends. My little brother? He was oblivious. And then I started having dreams. Lots of dreams. Disturbing dreams. I dreamt one night that a witch was after me. She was a rather good-looking young woman, but she was evil. There were strong associations of strangulation and vomiting, and I think I was trying to strangle her, but she just wouldn't die, and it seemed upsetting to kill something that beautiful. And then I could feel myself in real life getting sick to my stomach. I remember I woke up with a start and ripped the covers off me, and panic ran down the stairs to my parents' room. I got to my parents' room and explained what I had gone through, and they calmed me down and bundled me off back to bed, saying it was just a dream. But on another night, I woke up. I didn't recall having a dream or anything, I just remember waking up. And I swear, there was a woman standing over me. She had long hair and glowed kind of a gold light with a slight green tinge. It was actually like she was made of the light. And she was standing right over top of my bed, bent at the waist, neck ajar, peering down at me. I couldn't see her face, or at least I didn't look at it. I just saw this long-haired woman, bent over, looking at me. I pulled the covers up over my head to protect myself, and I tried to scream, "Mom, Dad!" But I couldn't. I was completely terrified, and only little squeaks came out. When I looked, the woman was still there staring at me, and finally I shrieked out, "Mom! Mom! Mom!" I heard my parents jump up and practically hit every box and piece of furniture on the way out of their bedroom, go through the kitchen, go through the hall, up the stairs, and then into my room. When my parents got to my room, the woman was gone. I pulled the covers aside. "A woman," I blurted out. "She was standing over me. She was gold and kind of green and just standing there looking at me." My mom sat down on the bed to calm me down, and I could see my dad checking out the window in the dormer out of the front of our house and into the street. "It's okay," my mom soothed me, and eventually she managed to convince me that it was just a trick of the streetlights coming in through the dormer. My brother apparently slept through the whole thing. After that Halloween, a month later, we moved to Shingletown Gap, and I lived for a year or two there. It was wonderful. I started fitting in a little better, and my brother and I had separate but attached rooms, and the place was just neat. There was this magical hiking spot by the reservoir up in the Gap, and I could ride my bike on the back roads. I quickly forgot about that weird, dark house on Crestmont. We moved a lot when we lived in State College, every year or two. Crestmont, Shingletown, North Allen, that was a dump, Legion Lane, and we only stayed until the grant my father's position was on petered out, and we left for good in 1983. Over the years, my parents would take post-Labor Day trips to Nag's Head with a couple of other families, and I would occasionally join them when I was in my 20s. If the wind wasn't too bad, we would light a bonfire on the beach and drink and talk. One year, we decided to tell ghost stories. "Tell them about Crestmont," my mom suggested. So I told them the story I've just told you. "Is that it?" my mom asked. "Oh, you didn't know, did you?" I looked at my mom, and she said, "The reason Crestmont was available for just a month was because they couldn't rent the place out. A college student had lived there before we moved in, and she hanged herself in the house." I was dumbstruck. A few years later, I was fascinated with everything Google Maps had to offer, so I decided to see if I could find that place on Crestmont. I remembered the street name, but I didn't remember the number. But to my surprise, Crestmont isn't a big street, only about 3 blocks. So, doing a quick search, I found the house. There was the alley, there was the dormer of my room, and then I switched to Street View. Now, I knew the truth. A woman hanged herself in that place we lived in a month before we moved in, and there are no streetlights anywhere close to that house. Daughter Predicted Bad Halloween by Alicia. Halloween Day, 2015. My daughter was 8 at the time and not excited to trick-or-treat at all. She kept saying, "Mom, I have a bad feeling. Something bad is going to happen." I kept trying to reassure her that it was just nerves, especially since there were a lot of clown costumes that year, and she wasn't a fan of those. So we met up with my sister and her 2 kids to trick-or-treat in her neighborhood. We did see a few clowns riding 4-wheelers, so I said to my daughter, "See? That's what you were worried about, but it's just kids dressed up." We finished up trick-or-treating with my sister and drove home, stopping at a gas station briefly. We had pulled into a designated parking spot, and a car was parked near us, but with their rear end facing my daughter's passenger back door where she was seated. All of a sudden, the lady in the car drove in reverse, backing directly into my daughter's door, and our entire car moved. I was like, "What the hell?" And now my daughter was screaming and crying. I got out of my car and checked on my kid to make sure she had no injuries, and she was okay but upset. Then the crazy lady of the other car took 2 young boys out of her car who were barefoot and in PJs, and was screaming at me to not call the cops. Obviously, I dialed 911, And while I was waiting for their arrival, this lady took the two boys and went into a bar across the street. The cop showed up and I said, "She went into that bar over there with two children. She must have called someone and they told her to return to the scene of the accident." So she came back and we were yelling at each other, and who shows up but my ex-boyfriend? Yeah, he was now dating this crazy lady. So she hit my car so hard it had to be realigned and the whole nine. I don't think she had car insurance the way she was acting and screaming not to call the cops. The whole way home my daughter said, "See, Mom, I told you something bad was going to happen." She was right, and I will never dismiss her feelings again. Also, she's 17 now and absolutely hates Halloween, and refused from then on to ever trick-or-treat again. Horror House for Sale, submitted by KT Line. When I graduated from college, I had a degree in business, but was struggling to get a job, period. What I found was an opportunity to sell real estate. So rather than work minimum wage jobs with no business experience, I decided to go and get my license to sell houses while still looking for another job. It worked out really well, actually, at first. The study and exams weren't that hard, and I figured I would be learning something at least in the realm of what I wanted to do later on, and that I could always use this as a backup job, or as they say these days, a side hustle. I had decent success starting out and sold a couple of homes with the help of my team. I enjoyed the freedom that it gave me, but just like every other job I had, there was a downside. I had recouped my costs of advertising and was in my own apartment and busting my hump to sell as much as I could, so that was great. There was one house that came my way that others were having difficulty selling. Although I noticed that over the past few years it kept coming up on the market, so I don't think it was the fault of anyone at my real estate place. Honestly, it felt right away like that episode of The Simpsons when Marge started selling houses. You know, she had the murder house on her hands. There were rumors that this house that I was about to try to sell was haunted or something, but me being a staunch skeptic laughed at that and said there must be something else wrong with the house structurally or whatever. But literally, there wasn't. I kind of was questioning what was wrong with the place, because at first glance and a deeper dive, the house was solid. Before I really get into things, this happened around Halloween of 2016. I want to say that I'm not some kind of believer all of a sudden because of what I experienced, but I do question things a little differently now. This house was in a nice neighborhood that was well established in our area. It had been built in 1986 and was a very large ranch. From the outside, it was everything someone would want in a home, and inside too. 2,200 square feet, a large 3-bay garage, a large in-ground pool in a massive fenced yard, a children's play set, updated appliances, everything. There was absolutely nothing anyone needed to move into this place. The basement was finished and even had a giant man cave down there with an attached gym area, with equipment to boot. Honestly, if I was in the market for a house and had the money, I would have been all over that thing. But there were a few oddities. There was one patch of grass in the back that would not grow grass for whatever reason. It was shaped in a triangle, and no matter what anyone did, no matter what anyone planted, grass would just not grow there. It wasn't a sticking point for anyone to purchase the home, but it was something that was visible in pictures and everyone who was interested in the house did bring up. And it wasn't like a teeny little spot. It was about 8 feet on each side of the triangle, so actually pretty big. Before I started getting involved with it, I talked to my boss, and he gave me the lowdown on the history of the past buyers. No one, it seems, had lived in the house more than 2 years, and some of them as few as 7 months. It just kept coming back up on the market. I should say that I live in New York State, and I forget and probably should look up before I submit this story to you, probably won't, any laws regarding telling someone if you believe a house is haunted before you sell it. I believe that is an honest question that a home purchaser can ask, but as I said, I forget. I haven't sold houses in a while. I went to the house on the first day and opened the lockbox for the keys and went inside and again was amazed. The house was completely empty save for some show furniture. It had hardwood floors shining, appliances sparkling, and because it was the end of October, the pool was closed, but everything outside looked fantastic. I had it all set in my mind that this house was going to go in a week. As the days wore on, I had a number of people look at the house, and everyone very much liked it. No one asked any weird questions, but I wasn't getting any offers. No big deal. It's not the easiest thing to just sell a house. You got to find the right person, and the right person has to find the right house. About a week into me showing the place is when I started to notice some things were a little goofy. One day I was waiting for a buyer standing in the kitchen, when all of a sudden, the doors to the refrigerator, dishwasher, and oven all opened at the same time on their own. For a second, I just stood there thinking maybe a plane had gone by or there was some strange vibration or, hell, a mini earthquake that I didn't notice. Yeah, I'm not sure if I just had blinders on, knowing what I knew about the house, or what. But I simply closed all of the doors and just went back to my laptop. The potential buyers came, checked everything out, and nothing happened. Another person was supposed to stop by, but they canceled, so I was just going to wrap it up for the day. That's when I heard some noise coming from down the hall towards the areas of the bedrooms, the master bedroom specifically. I walked down the hallway and just felt off. It felt like something was walking behind me, but also something was standing in front of me. I can't really explain it. It was just like a very strange pressure, like there was some kind of buffer behind me and in front of me as I walked down the hall. When I got to the master bedroom, I saw what the noise was. It was a curtain rod and curtain that had come off the mooring and was sitting sideways across one of the windows. Again, no big deal. I picked it up, put it back in its place, and stood for a minute before heading to the door. That Sunday, I had an open house and was expecting a number of people to stop by, and they did. There were some families and there were some single people as well, so I showed the house and talked all about its great features to everyone who came in. Made sure they signed in, handed out the information about the house, and got my card. And I could hear people walking around pointing out things that they loved. I was getting excited. Everything was going well, and I was hoping that one of these people would be the ones to put in an offer. You might be asking at this point, what happened to the past homeowners at this place? That I can't answer. I do know that they had purchased another home in a different part of the state, but still owned and were listing this house. I guess they didn't have a ton of pressure to sell it, but that also gave me pause. In any market, maybe not so much back then though, to hold on to an investment like this meant that they had to have some decent money, but again, that's none of my business, I suppose. So my last potential buyers came through just before I was closing up at 3. Again, everything was great. They were down in the finished basement, admiring the large bar and setup of everything. And then I heard the woman of the couple give out a little shout. I went downstairs immediately and asked if everything was okay, and the woman was holding the man and he was holding her. She was very upset, and I asked if I could help with anything or if anything was wrong. The woman just pointed to a small area of the basement where the breaker and the sump pump were. They were blocked off from the rest of the room with a door, but the door was open. They just stood there, not answering my question. So I walked over to where she was pointing, and I flicked the light on in the little room. The first thing I noticed was a smell that was just off. It wasn't a sewer smell or anything that gross, but it just had a very strange odor. Kind of like something had been burning. But I don't know what was being burned, and it certainly wasn't electrical. But then I noticed something that I hadn't noticed before. There was a small crucifix on the wall, and it was hanging upside down. Why that made the woman yell out and get that upset, I'll never know. I can only assume that perhaps she was very religious. But I just straightened the crucifix and tried to joke my way out of it, saying something like, "Gee, I don't know why that's like that," or "I never noticed that before." I asked them if there was anything else I could help them with or if they were still interested. And they were very non-committal and went up the stairs and left. I was going to go and do my walkthrough to make sure everything was back in place before I wrapped it up. I was going to hit the links with my buddies, so my mind was a little bit elsewhere. That's when I heard another commotion from back down in the basement. Great, I thought. I went back downstairs, and while I was standing there, the couch in the man cave that was also coming with the house if the new prospective owners wanted the furniture, suddenly shot off the wall directly towards me. And I don't mean one corner of it popped out. I mean the entire couch came shooting across the wood floor right at me. Then the lights went out. The couch softly bumped into me, but I was a little put off, to say the least. Of course it scared me. It would scare even the biggest of ghost hunters. I hit my phone real quick to get some light and went back upstairs really fast, not even remembering I could have just flicked the switch for the lights on in the basement. So I turned the lights on again, went back downstairs, and the couch was back against the wall. I never heard it go back, and had it not bumped into me, I would have thought I had made the entire thing up. But it did move. Over my shoulder, I noticed something else. The light in the little sump pump room was on, and the crucifix was upside down again. Trying to keep my wits about me, trying to stay calm, I walked across the room, flipped the crucifix back to its upright position, turned the lights off, and then left the house. On my way to golf, I called my boss, but he didn't answer, so I left him a message. I hoped he would call me back later that night, but he didn't. I had another open house the following week, and periodically during the week I would stop by the places I was selling to make sure everything was okay, just like any good realtor would do. At one time, I went in the evening, and it was just about 7 o'clock, so the sun was setting and it was getting dark. I couldn't help notice, up the block, that every light in the house was on. For one second, I thought maybe it was my boss or another team member, but when I opened the door, there was no one there. Of course, it was a total tip-off that there were no other cars in the driveway. But here's the messed up thing. The minute I opened the front door to the foyer, all of the lights in the house were off. I stepped back a little onto the sidewalk and looked at the house, and none of the lights were on. Again, I thought maybe I was going crazy. I ran through the house to make sure all the windows and everything were secure, and it was. There was no one in the backyard, so I locked up, put everything back in the lockbox, got into my car, and started to drive away. In my rearview mirror, I looked back at the house, and all of the lights were on again. I took a chance and just said, screw it. If my boss happened to drive by and see that all the lights were on, I'm going to say I just forgot to turn them off. His first question, I know, would have been, though, why did you leave them all on? I went home. The next day, I stopped by the office to talk to my boss and told him about the goofy things that I had seen. And he just said, well, we know there is something strange at that house. He was really joking about it, like he wasn't taking it seriously. But I told him, no, really, there's something going on there. He said, if you don't want to sell the house, I'm not going to force you to. But I highly suggest you do. You know the commission is good. I steeled my resolve and went back to the house for a potential buyer that afternoon. When they got there, they were a young couple, very exuberant and loved everything about the house, especially the pool. While walking around the backyard, the guy did ask about the strange patch of grass, and I told him I wasn't really sure what was going on with that, and that it would be something he'd probably want to look into if he did purchase the home. It wasn't that big of a deal to him, so we went back inside. This couple had way more questions about the house than anyone else did, so the appointment took a little bit longer than I had planned. While we were standing in the front foyer getting ready to leave, there was another loud crash from down the hall. I immediately hoped it was simply the curtain rod falling over again. I told them I would be right back and went down the hall to check, and the same feeling of that pressure was there in the hallway. I was keeping my cool, but when I went into the master bedroom, this is when something was very, very wrong. Not only had the curtain rod fallen over, but the show bed was in the middle of the room with all of the covers off on the floor. That certainly hadn't been that way 5 minutes prior to this. I stood for a second and then decided to get these people out of the house before I came back to fix things up. But I'm not going to lie, again, I was spooked. I said goodbye to the folks, gave them more information, and they said that they'd be getting back to me, that they were very interested in putting in an offer. After they left, I went back and straightened out the master bedroom. But as I was walking down the hall, again with that strange feeling, I heard something in the basement. At this point, I was freaking the fuck out. I did not want to be in here by myself anymore, and all of that staunch skepticism was slowly seeping out of my body. I went downstairs into the man cave again, saw that the door to the sump pump room was open with the light on, and the crucifix was upside down again. This time, that feeling of pressure was all through the basement. It felt like arms or something all the way around me, trying to hug me or pull me close. But not in a good way. It was creepy as hell. I slowly started to walk over to the sump pump room, and the couch came flying off the wall again. This time not at me, just across the entire basement and bumped into the far wall. I turned to look at that and heard a noise behind me. I prayed it was just the sump pump, but it wasn't. It was a low rumbling with a hiss sound. When I turned, the crucifix had been placed back right side up, but as I watched it, it spun upside down on its own. I didn't even bother to turn the light off in that room or shut the door or touch the crucifix. I didn't even bother to move the couch. It hadn't gone back to its own place on its own this time. I ran up the stairs. I grabbed my things, made sure all the lights were off, and ran out of the house. I jumped into my car and looked back, and again, all of the lights that I had just turned off were on. I immediately called my boss and told him that he should come over here and that something was very, very wrong, that something was up with this house. He laughed and said, "Stay put, I'm on my way." I sat in my car for about 10 minutes, and he finally pulled up. He was again making fun of me and making little noises like, "Woo," doing his little ghost noises, and he just kept saying, "Happy Halloween, buddy." So we went inside. I was feeling a little braver, but still, after what I had just experienced, I really did not want to go in there. We went inside, and my boss went into the kitchen first. It was attached to the foyer down a little hallway with a half bath in between. He stopped after he turned the lights on and said, "You didn't leave this place like this?" I couldn't even see what he was talking about, so I quickly got over to his side. Again, all of the doors of the appliances were open. All of the sheets of information for the house were scattered all over the room, and a bottle of hand soap that I had had by the sink had been dumped all over the kitchen island. I, of course, said, "There's no way in hell you know I would have left this place like this. And it's only been 10 minutes, man." I started to clean things up, and he shut all the doors to the appliances. And that's when the noise came from the basement again. He told me to stay put. He was going down there by himself. I finished cleaning up as best I could with little materials that I had and figured I would come back in the morning with some paper towels to do a better job. My boss was down there maybe 3 minutes, and suddenly I heard his footsteps pounding. He burst into the kitchen, his face white as a ghost, and I said, "Dude, what's going on? Are you okay?" He just looked at me and said, "We need to go now." As I began to protest, saying, "Well, I still have to clean up," he shut me down and said, "Get in your car and go home." I did as I was told. We locked up together, jumped in our cars, and got out of there. I called him that night, but he didn't answer, and I also texted, but he didn't respond to that either. I asked him to tell me what he had seen. The next morning I went into the office, but he wasn't there, so I immediately called him, and he answered. I asked him what the hell was going on. What had he seen? And all he said was, "Don't worry about that house anymore. Take it off your list. Don't worry about it. I'll handle it." And like that, the house was out of my life. We stopped listing it. I don't know what my boss did or how he worked any of that stuff, but apparently he just told the owners that we could no longer sell it and we were no longer going to list it for them. Again, when I found that out, I questioned him and said, "What did you see down there?" After all this happened, about a week later, we were both in the office at the end of the day. I finally sat down with him and said, "What did you see in that basement to make you decide to not list that house?" He looked at me with dark eyes and said, "I don't want anyone to ever see that." And I said, "You got to tell me, what was it?" He said when he went down to the basement in the sump pump room, but it seemed to be behind a gauze of a greenish-black smoke. He said a face appeared in that smoke, and it was the most hideous thing he had ever seen. It was the face of an old man that seemed to be rotting or decaying or something. He had a hard time describing it. All he said was it whispered one word, his name, and that's when he took off from the basement. I have no idea who bought that house, but someone did. I have no idea if they stayed longer than that average of 2 years, but I'm rarely in that neighborhood. Every once in a while I'll drive by and either see a car I've never seen before parked in the driveway, or none at all. Just before this, I did check Zillow and saw that the house had been purchased 4 times since 2016. This last owner has been there for the last 3 years. Maybe whatever is in the basement is no longer there. I can only hope that that's the case for whoever bought that house. Cemetery Night to Remember by Dev19. A couple of years ago, on a cool autumn night, I had an unforgettable experience that will stay with me forever. It all started when a group of friends and I decided to visit the local cemetery after hours. Rumors had been circulating that the cemetery was haunted, and we were curious to see for ourselves if there was any truth to the stories. I was with a couple of friends in one car, while another friend drove a separate vehicle. As we made our way through the dark and winding roads leading to the cemetery, we could feel a sense of unease creep over us. The night was still and eerily quiet, the only sound being the rustling of leaves in the wind. As we pulled up to the gates of the cemetery, I could feel my heart racing in anticipation. The gates were locked, but that didn't stop us. We parked our cars outside and decided to explore on foot. The moon cast an eerie glow over the gravestones, creating long shadows that seemed to dance in the darkness. We walked amongst the headstones, reading the names and dates etched into the cold stone, and the air was thick with a sense of foreboding, as if we were not alone in the cemetery. Suddenly, my friend who was driving the other car let out a gasp and pointed ahead. We all turned to look, and that's when we saw it. A small figure darting across the road in front of the truck. We were all frozen in place, trying to make sense of what we had just witnessed. I felt a chill run down my spine, my arms covered in goosebumps. We quickly got back into our cars as we followed the others out of the cemetery. As we drove down the dark road, my friend in the other car suddenly slammed on the brakes. We pulled up beside them and rolled down the window, asking what had happened. They explained that they had heard a loud bang on the back of their car, as if something had hit it. We all got out of our cars to inspect the damage. To our horror, we found small handprints smeared across the back of the car, as if a child had touched it. The realization hit us like a ton of bricks. The figure we had seen running across the road was not a figment of our imagination. It was real. Fear gripped us as we stood in the darkness, unsure of what to do next. We could feel a presence watching us, a sense of malevolence that sent shivers down our spines. Without a word, we all got back into our cars and drove away from the cemetery as quickly as we could. To this day, I still cannot explain what we saw that night. Was it the spirit of a restless soul haunting the cemetery? Or something more sinister? Whatever it was, it left an indelible mark on me and my friends. We never spoke of that night again, too afraid to relive the terror that had gripped us in the darkness of the cemetery. But the memory of that unforgettable night will always stay with me, a chilling reminder of the thin veil that separates the living from the dead. What Was Unseen by Pumpkin Man 25. My family's always been big on Halloween. Our homes are decorated, we walk the streets when we were kids, and host costume parties now that we're older. I've got lots of good memories of the night with my two older brothers, mother, and friends. But there's one particular story that we still frequently relate on Halloween via a family group message nowadays that was not as pleasant as the others. A downright chilling experience that has forever embedded itself into our collective reflections. October 31st, 1991. I had turned 2 in June and was already in my own bedroom, which was the designated nursery beforehand. We lived in a suburb of Houston, Texas that is today a curved row of houses, but back then it was a densely forested area. There was a large window in my room that looked across the backyard and into the woods beyond. On this Halloween, the moon was in a waning crescent shape and projected just enough light to see by. I had a big plastic cutout jack-o'-lantern hanging by a thumbtack on my wall, thin traces of splintered moonlight draped onto its big grinning face. An eerie setting indeed for what is still my favorite night of the year. My mom, brothers, and I were all worn out after a lengthy candy excursion that went well after our usual bedtime. My 2 siblings had their own rooms, and my parents were watching Night of the Living Dead in the living room. I laid under the covers, taking in the sound of the swirling ceiling fan overhead, my eyes drifting towards my window. And that's when I heard it. A faint scratching, like the pawing of a kitten on a glass door. Only we didn't have a kitten, and there certainly wasn't a glass door in my room. I suddenly became fully awake, and wondering what that sound was. I listened carefully to the gentleness of the silence, the swirling of the ceiling fan, and Barbara's screams coming from the living room television, a symphony of horns bursting to life as she was chased to her car by a horde of the undead. Then it came again. The scratching sound, like fingernails at the base of my window now. I looked towards the window, nothing there. Slithers of Halloween moonlight passing through the treetops and rushing into my bedroom. And it came again, from something wholly unseen. A ghost? A murderer? This thing that my brothers told me about called the boogeyman? Some other creature from the deepest recesses of the forest. Scratching and scratching, trying to break in, trying to eat me, murder me, or zap me to planets unknown. Scratch, scratch, scratch. The invisible fingers of something that could only be lurking on the other side of my window. Finally, I couldn't restrain myself any longer, and I screamed like a 2.5-year-old has never screamed before. My mom came charging into my room, bursting the door open like a firefighter, and I cried out to her that there was something at my window, that it was trying to get in. She listened for a minute and then heard the scratching sound too. Alarmed, she turned on the light and raced to the window. Nothing. No ghost, no murderer, no boogeyman. Not even a lizard or a moth. Not even a tree limb, but still it scratched and scratched. My mom called for my dad, and by this time my brothers were rushing into my room too with pop guns in their hands. My dad stepped inside and heard the scratching sound as well. He went to the window beside my mom, but turned around when he too saw nothing outside. But yet the sound came again. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Finally, we saw what it was. Scraping the wall just above my bed, just above my head, the plastic cutout of the grinning jack-o'-lantern. It moved in the wind of my ceiling fan, the thumbtack having loosened its grip somehow. My dad took it down, and the scratching suddenly stopped. What a fright it was, though, on that Halloween night. My brothers still enjoy poking fun at me about it, although none of us are below the age of 30 anymore. Getting and Giving a Halloween Fright by John Quick. Around Halloween of 2010 or 2011, I was in Texas living in an apartment with my then-girlfriend who grew up a Jehovah's Witness. She's never celebrated a birthday, let alone the best holiday of the year. But now that she was living by her own rules, she was up for some new experiences. She wanted to wear a costume, walk the neighborhood streets, and see some spooky shit. The whole 9 yards. Halloween is my favorite time of year, so I was more than happy to be the one to introduce her to it. The day we got our costumes, nothing crazy. She painted her face up in zombie or some kind of ghoul-like fashion. I decided to go with those little latex pieces you glue to your face and blend in with flesh-toned paint. It came out great, better than I could have hoped. I got one on my forehead that looked like a deep cut. Another thing that looked like a big hole had been ripped out of my cheek. I dripped some of that gelatinous fake blood that stays in place and looks fresh for hours. It looked real. We both admired it for the next few hours before the sun started setting and we hit the streets. Our apartment complex is surrounded by neighborhoods, so we had plenty of residential streets to walk down. We were having a great time looking at all the house decorations and kids wearing costumes, and she was loving it. So much that she was ready to take it to the next level. She wanted to go up a few blocks to the cemetery. And I was like, yeah, that's a Halloween thing. Let's go. To get there, we had to walk a little ways on a street that was pretty busy. And it was extra busy that night. There isn't a sidewalk, just a bike lane wedged between the road and a grassy hill. We were walking against traffic, and the sun was gone, and it was just blinding yellow lights whooshing past us about every 3 seconds. The bike lane was steadily getting more narrow, and we were gradually moving up onto the hill, her walking a few paces ahead of me, and me starting to think that this was getting a little sketchy. We were going along and then got stuck walking at the edge of this steep hill in the busy road, when suddenly I heard the rev of an engine. 2 headlights coming our way suddenly turned into 4 as a big Ford F-250 tried to go around the slower car in front of it. The truck tried to move around it on the bike lane, and like all those Ford models, it had the extended side mirrors that stick out like 2 feet. I was watching my girlfriend ahead of me as its passenger side mirror slammed into her right shoulder and spun her around. The mirror exploded into a million little pieces of plastic and glass, and I was like, holy fucking shit. I ran over to her, and she was still standing, kind of dazed. I was asking her if she was okay, and she was just nodding her head. I was thinking maybe she hadn't felt it yet, and I was terrified to look. But I gently pulled her sweater to the side to check her shoulder. All I saw was a faint bruise forming. She was talking, and after another minute of questioning, it seemed like she was really fine, and I realized they probably made those mirrors to explode on impact for that very reason. In the meantime, the driver of the truck had pulled over with his hazards on a little down from the way we had come. We both walked over there, both of us still kind of dazed from shock and fear, and the driver got out. He was a Mexican guy and didn't know a lot of English and just kept saying, "No insurance," in kind of a have mercy on me tone. My girlfriend made it up to the truck first, so he was really just kind of saying it to her. When I emerged from the darkness is when it started to get weird, and funny in hindsight. He was still mumbling to her about no insurance, and she was saying something about him needing to be more careful. He finally looked at me and stopped talking completely. I saw his eyes really studying my face while he turned white as a bedsheet. I was really too freaked out from what had happened to put it all together. I was, however, outwardly calm. My girlfriend seemed fine. She was talking, moving, and breathing. And eventually, I was okay to kind of start smiling to try to take the edge off of our new Mexican friend and make him feel less freaked out, too. We stood by the truck for a few minutes, me and her just like, oh well, I guess we're good. But the guy, meanwhile, it was still just dead set on me and not saying anything. He couldn't understand us anyway, he didn't speak English. Me and my girlfriend looked at each other and mutually felt the situation had run its course. We told him good night, and then we walked off into the night. A little later, we were rehashing what had taken place, especially wondering why he was acting so weird. It's only then that we recovered our senses and remembered how good my prosthetics looked. The guy probably didn't have time to see who he had hit with the mirror. He probably had the scariest roller coaster ride of emotion when she came up first and seemed fine, only for me to pop out looking like I tried shaving with a lawnmower. And then, the way I was standing there smiling, saying, "It's all right, buddy, don't worry about it." It was both the most scared I'd ever been on Halloween and the most I had ever scared someone else.